firstly, Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh, everyone. Thank you for obviously joining the Zoom today. We're lucky enough to have Jvala today, going to be talking to us a bit about Guru Tegh Bahadur Ji's Prakash. But before we get on to the actual, we've got a little bio, just a couple of sort of background questions, buddy. Mainly a bit about your background and how you actually became sort of interested in translating the Suraj Prakash, and also a bit about maybe the 54 Proverbs book. Had a quick look at that. It looks it's really cool.
Thanks. Yeah. Well, the book actually comes out of my translation work. This is something that we're going to talk about in the presentation as well, is when we get through and we look into these pre-colonial texts, when we look into these old texts, oftentimes translating word by word is not sufficient. It's not enough. You need to understand context. You need to understand idioms. You need to understand proverbs, because those are utilized extensively. If you don't know, how to translate them, if you don't know how they're used in certain contexts, you're going to mistranslate the line completely. This is something we're going to look at in some of the Dasambani that we're going to look at the end of this presentation. But in terms of the Suraj Prakash, the Suraj podcast, that just comes out of my studies at university right now. I'm looking at pre-colonial texts, specifically Suraj Prakash. And as I was just reading through the stories of Guru Har Gobind, I would send some voice clips to my friends, my brother, actually friends in England, Cambridge as well. And, they would tell me like, you're sending these clips, these are hilarious, these are interesting. Why don't you just record this, from start to finish? You're obviously reading the chapter. Why don't you just record the whole chapter? And, we started off doing that, and it kind of just went off from there. And in terms of, my reading of the Suraj Prakash, that's because of my university work, where I'm going to hopefully write on Sikh literary tradition, Sikh historical narratives from a pre-colonial lens. And to do that, you need to read extensively through these texts. And, Suraj Prakash is like a lifetime of work. Reading even a chapter a day, it would take like 7 to 10 years. Like it's in a massive text. It's ginormous. So, it's just something, it's something that just took off just randomly. It wasn't really planned. And the response has been really great.
Yeah, definitely. And so why the Suraj Prakash Granth specifically? Like what sort of pulled you towards that of the other Granths available? And I guess even learning how to translate it would have been really difficult. So if you just did a bit about that, yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question, because we're gonna at the start of this conversation, at the start of this presentation, we're gonna look through the other pre-colonial texts. And it's like, why Suraj Prakash, right? So Suraj Prakash is written in such a way. Well, first of all, let's back up a little bit. Right now, if you go to any gurdwaras in India, the major ones like Harmandir Sahib, Manji Sahib, there beside it, they do Katha of Suraj Prakash every day. Takat Hazur Sahib, they do Katha of Suraj Prakash every day. It used to be a tradition in the other Takats as well to do Katha every day of Suraj Prakash. This is still done by traditional Gyanis, like Sampradaya Gyanis who are from a traditional learning institution and lineage. And there's a reason for that, because Suraj Prakash is a systematic way of covering all the gurus, and it's embedded with philosophy as well, and it's embedded with a specific narrative that helps you soak in that information as well. If you look into some of the older texts, which obviously Santokh Singh is using when writing his version, Mema Prakash, Bansavi Nama, the Guru Blast texts, they're not as, they don't paint that full of a picture, and, when trying to embed this information in the listener, you really need, an expert storyteller to kind of guide you through that. And I'm sure, like, for people that have heard the podcast, this is some of the feedback that I get, is that people say, like, when I'm listening to the story, which is not my rendition, by the way, this is, I've translated the text, and then I'm just kind of reciting, or I'm saying it in English. So people tell me, like, I feel like I'm there. It takes me to that environment. It takes me to that atmosphere, because the poet, the great poet Santokh Singh, has in such a way, like, curated this information that it really sinks in. It's much different than, 1621, Guru Tegh Bahadur is born, 1622, this happened, 1623, this happened. That's boring. It doesn't stick. But when you embed that information into a narrative, and you do it poetically, and then you do it describing, the environment, describing even like the details of the trees and the details of the houses and the gardens and stuff like that. It just comes to life in a much better way. So ever since Santokh Singh wrote that in 1843, when he presented it to the Akal Takht, all the learning institutions at that point were like, this is it. This is what we're gonna do katha of every day to, teach the public about these stories. So, there's a reason why over 150 years, these Gyanis have been doing it every day, as compared to other pre-colonial texts.
Thank you so much for those really interesting responses. I think we've got kind of enough people now that we'll kick off the main bit of the talk itself. So first and foremost, very happy Gurpurab to everyone. Thank you all for coming, for being here. And a big thank you for the Sikh committee for putting this together. As Aaron said, we're extremely lucky to have Jvala Singh with us today to talk to us and to talk with us as well about the life of Guru Tegh Bahadur Ji on the day of their Parkash Purab. I'm sure some of you will already know who Jvala Singh is, but for those of you who don't, Jvala Singh is a PhD student at the University of British Columbia in the Department of South Asian Studies. He's the author of 54 Punjabi Proverbs, and as he was just talking about, he's also the creator and the presenter of the Suraj podcast, in which he gives a chapter-by-chapter summary of what is one of the most important pre-colonial texts that we have in our tradition. What's lovely about it is that for us in the English-speaking diaspora, it gives us an access to a very authentic and unfiltered capture of history. And I think I'm right in saying you're about 135 episodes in, roughly. So there's hours of great content there, and couldn't recommend it highly enough. Before I hand over to Jvala for his presentation, there's just like a little bit of housekeeping. Firstly, the event is being recorded and will be uploaded to the Society's YouTube channel. So if you prefer to have your camera off, you're more than welcome to do so. Secondly, the format is that Jvala Singh will speak for about 20 to 30 minutes with a presentation, and then the remainder of the time that we have will be allocated towards a discussion. And we would very much like it to be a discussion and as interactive as possible. So if you have questions that you want to ask, but equally answers that you want to offer or points that you want to raise, then please don't be shy and feel free to do so. It goes without saying that if you are going to make any points, then please do so kind of respectfully and in a non-combative manner. And then the last thing to say is that if you do have any questions that crop up during Jwala's talk, just put them in the chat and we can address them either during the presentation or at the end, kind of as appropriate. So I think that's probably enough from me, and I'll hand over to Jvala.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm just going to share my screen. Yeah, so, first of all, I want to thank the Society for inviting me. I wanted to shed some light on the stories related to Guru Tegh Bahadur. I was fortunate to work on this calendar project, Mahalla 9 project. If anybody knows about the project, where we went through various important moments of the Guru's life. This image here, at the cover here, is actually a painting in the calendar project. So if you haven't checked that out, I'll put a link in it after the presentation. As we're talking about Guru Tegh Bahadur on this historical date, it only makes sense to bring up the stories that we have written down about the Guru. So I've compiled a list here of the major sources written down in Sikh history by Sikhs telling the life story of Guru Tegh Bahadur. So here we have, Dasam Guru Granth Sahib, written by Guru Gobind Singh himself, the son of Guru Tegh Bahadur, in the late 1600s. Gur Soba is written 1711-ish by one of the court poets of Guru Gobind Singh. We have Gurbalas Pachai Chemi, a really important text written by Bhagat Singh, but it was narrated by the esteemed by Mani Singh Shaheed, Same with Guru Bilas Pasha Dasmi. It's written in 1751 by Kaur Singh, but it was narrated to him by Mani Singh. Bansali Nama, 1769, an important text as well because Kesa Singh Shibbar comes out of the Shibbar family. If people know the Saki about the Shahidi of Guru Tegh Bahadur, Matidas, Satidas, those Sikhs of the Guru were from that family, the Shibbar family. So it's a very important text. It holds a lot of information about that time. We have 400th Parkash, 1776, from Sarup Das Palla, who was actually a direct descendant from the third Guru, Guru Amar Das. And then we have the Guru Pratap Suraj Prakash Granth, the source of the Suraj podcast, and also, in a sense, a culmination of all of the previous texts about the Gurus. There's some other texts in between there, like Pant Prakash comes early 1800s. I didn't include that here just because it mainly focuses on the Missal period and not the life stories of all the Gurus. So I'm starting off talking about these sources because it's important that we anchor our conversations, our talks, any information about the Gurus from sourced material. This is something that I think is important for us as youth going through the history. As we'll go into the discussion, we talk about pre-colonial versus post-colonial, and we'll show why, looking at the pre-colonial sources, why that's so important. So, first starting off, in terms of the common narrative of Guru Tegh Bahadur, here we have a painting of Guru Tegh Bahadur by Sobha Singh, and images tell a lot. They're iconographic. They illuminate on virtues, characteristics, aspects of personality. In these Sobha Singh paintings, we see a very peaceful form of Guru Tegh Bahadur. We see, he looks meditative. He looks quite simple in appearance. And if we look at some of the older texts like Suraj Prakash, we hear of these aspects. We hear, actually in episode 70, there's a whole episode dedicated just to the disposition of Guru Tegh Bahadur. It mentions how the young Tegh Bahadur at that time, this is in Kirtpur, while Guru Hargobind is the Guru, but it mentions how the young Tegh Bahadur had a really detached mindset, almost antisocial, one might say, from afar, without properly understanding the depth of the young to-be Guru. He wouldn't speak too much. He wouldn't help out in the admin of the Guru's house. He was really meditative. He would, after weeks, he would come to see his father, the Guru, like after 20 days, 25 days. In between that time, he was just by himself. It paints that picture that we see here in the Sobha Singh painting. And then when we look to the writings of Guru Gobind Singh, his son, some 20 to 30 years after this period, it talks about Guru Tegh Bahadur when he's first anointed as Guru, when he ascends to the throne of Guru. He's traveling through parts of South Asia. He is heading to pilgrimage sites held in great esteem by the local traditions. And through the writings of Guru Gobind Singh, we get another picture, which kind of substantiates, which kind of backs that up, that, when it says, Jab hi jat Tribeni pai, when Guru Tegh Bahadur went to Tribeni, Allahabad, Punadan then Kartabatai, he spent his days there in service to people and in charity. And this again paints the picture of, the Guru having a really soft, disposition, very compassionate, very meditative. And as we go through and we look into the Bani of Guru Tegh Bahadur, this was incorporated into the Guru Granth Sahib by Guru Gobind Singh and by Mani Singh when finalizing the Damdami Beard. So Mani Singh himself was the compiler. And thankfully, we have a text, Guru Bilas Pasha Shami, which was written down by Bhagat Singh, as I mentioned, but it was narrated by Mani Singh. So Bhai Mani Singh compiled the Damdami Beard. He was there influential in incorporating the Gurbani of Guru Tegh Bahadur into all the Guru Granth Sahib. And he's also written about it, or he narrated about it in Guru Bilas Pasha Shami. He writes that, the Bani of Guru Tegh Bahadur is so infused with Vairag, detachment and Gyan, that when you listen to it, you just detach from the world. It breaks all these bonds that people have to the world. And again, that it paints that picture, as we can see, of the Guru being, detached, meditative. And this photo actually that you see here, this is from a swarup that Bhai Mani Singh himself compiled in 1713, where he essentially made kind of a reference type of granth, including both, Adi Guru Granth Sahib and Dasam Guru Granth Sahib. So including both the writings of the previous gurus and Guru Gobind Singh's writings in one. So all of that to say is that, a common narrative that we have about Guru Tegh Bahadur, meditative, peaceful, compassionate, that is backed up by history. We do have that. It comes through in the stories, it comes through in the Gurbani, but there are other aspects that I want to talk about that kind of paint a fuller picture of the Guru. And another aspect that I want to talk about is the Marshal. This is a painting from Nansuk, so late 1700s. And I'm doing this to expand our vision a little bit about Guru Tegh Bahadur, bringing in some other qualities, virtues, which maybe are not commonly spoken about today, but are in the old histories. And we often describe his father, Guru Hargobind, as a master of Miri and Piri, of the royal, the sovereign, martial, as well as the Piri, the spiritual. But oftentimes, I don't think this common narrative, in that narrative, we don't associate that with his son, Guru Tegh Bahadur. Just starting off with the name Tegh Bahadur, like the valiant with the sword. We don't have to go far. And in Suraj Prakash, it mentions, I saw that Cambridge shared that translation as well from Suraj Prakash of Guru Hargobind naming Tegh Bahadur, saying that, he'll display Bahaduri in front of the Tegh. This is a reference foreshadowing the Shahidi. And if we look physically in Suraj Prakash, it mentions, this is in episode 35 to 36 of the Suraj podcast, Guru Tegh Bahadur's wedding. It describes the Guru being, similar in stature with his father, Guru Hargobind being known as being tall and strong. So Guru Tegh Bahadur in a similar way, very tall, broad-shouldered, long arms, thick arms, even at that young age when he was getting married. And it was in that young age when Guru Tegh Bahadur joined his father in battle, at the Battle of Kartarpur in 1635, when Guru Tegh Bahadur was only 14 years old. So this is mentioned again on the podcast for those who want to listen to the entire battle. We spent over 6 episodes going through it in detail. Guru Tegh Bahadur's role is described in episode 53. And that's what this painting is depicting. So in the Battle of Kartarpur, the whole city was surrounded by Mughal forces of Shah Jahan. It was led by Pandey Khan. The city had a wall around it. And to support his father, Guru Hargobind, and the Sikh troops, the young Tegh Bahadur then mounts up to provide support fire with his bow and arrow and his matchlock rifle. So on the far left of the painting, you can see Mata Nanaki. Mata Nanaki, the second wife of Guru Hargobind, the mother of Guru Tegh Bahadur, was just a pillar and extremely influential personality in Sikh history. For those who want to read more about Mata Nanaki, there's a blog post about it on the Suraj Podcast website. But this painting depicts her standing on top of the roof, watching the battle unfold, watching the viciousness of war. When she saw her young son mount up and begin to ride out. So she then begins to yell out to young Tegh Bahadur, saying, come back. She starts to send servants over to bring Guru Tegh Bahadur back, but he just replies, listen, we are weapon bearers. We are Shastratari. This is our duty to fight. And this was the unshakable spirit, that indomitable spirit, that even as a 14-year-old boy, Guru Tegh Bahadur possessed, learning that, of course, off of his father. Another thing that Guru Tegh Bahadur learned off his father was hunting. For those who don't know, Guru Hargobind was an avid hunter. Bhai Gurdas in his Vara mentioned this explicitly, how Guru Hargobind's always on the move. He keeps hunting dogs with him, which he takes out to hunt. And in Mema Prakash, so in 1776, as I mentioned, written by a descendant of Guru Amar Das, it mentions that Guru Tegh Bahadur, even at a young age, would accompany his father on these hunting expeditions. So this was a practice that was started by Guru Hargobind, and it didn't stop with Guru Hargobind, it continued on. There's a story that comes up in both Mehma Prakash and Suraj Prakash, talking about Maluk Das. So as I mentioned before with a quote from Guru Gobind Singh when he talks about his father's stay at Allahabad, at the Tribeni, the story happens with Maluk Das. It happens just before they reach Allahabad. So Guru Tegh Bahadur's out with his 6 warriors on these travels, enjoying the beautiful forests and engaging in hunting. There was a sadhu there, his name was Maluk Das, who really wanted to see, the 9th Nanak. He heard about Guru Tegh Bahadur in that area. He also heard that at that point, the Guru was engaged in hunting, and he was confused. He was like, I'm vegetarian. He was a little distraught because of that. He felt a little bit let down. He wouldn't want to meet the Guru now because of this. And, he was a sadhu, he was a holy man type. He didn't want any confrontation. In the text, and Suraj Prakash mentions, this Maluk Das, he was like, all right, that Guru does hunting, that's fine. Who am I? I'm nobody. What am I going to go over there and say to him? I should just stay home and just carry on, basically. But he was thinking all of that in a really sad way. And in the stories, it mentions how Guru Tegh Bahadur, understanding this, that he was, Maluk Das was, he was a devotee, he was a Sikh, he was beloved of the Guru, but he had become deluded because of that. And he realized that was happening in Maluk Das's mind. And the text mentions how Guru Tegh Bahadur says, well, this guy lost faith just because of what he saw on the exterior. But he had no love for, what was happening internally in me. He was too caught up in, oh, he does this, he does that, but he wasn't looking into the actual virtues, characteristics that were internal. And this is something I'm going to touch on at the end of the presentation as well, because there's a sense that Guru Tegh Bahadur is not putting on a show for anybody. He is who he is. And it's fine if that guy Maluk Das was a vegetarian, but he was just not looking at the internal constitution of the Guru. So as I was saying, hunting was a part of that Medi tradition, and in the same way that hunting was part of that Medi tradition that Guru Tegh Bahadur was carrying on. Started by Guru Hargobind, this also ties into the political savviness that is associated with the Medi as well, which Guru Tegh Bahadur embodied. So much of Guru Tegh Bahadur's life after ascending to the throne was spent traveling around South Asia, going as far east as Bangladesh, basically just south of Bhutan, around the Brahmaputra River, really far east. Something over like 700 kilometers east of Patna. And Patna is even really east from Punjab. So we're talking a ways away from home. And this painting, actually we see on the slide here, is from Dhaka of Bangladesh, where when Guru Tegh Bahadur visited there, he's visiting in that area because also Guru Nanak had been to that area. So we all know Guru Nanak traveled vast amount of distances. So Guru Tegh Bahadur was also basically the most traveled besides Guru Nanak. So he traveled extensively as well. So Guru Tegh Bahadur, when he traveled, he visited those places that Guru Nanak traveled. He met some Sikhs in that area. He met a Sikh there in Dhaka where he was. And actually that Sikh, his mother, when the Guru was leaving that village, the mother was like, you're leaving. I really want to see you all the time. This is terrible. What am I going to do? I can't travel with you. The Guru's like, don't worry about it. The mother actually goes to the royal court and gets the painter from that court. And this is documented by Dr. Talochan Singh. He's done some research on this if you want to look that up. So that woman gets this, royal painter. And then the painter, this is mentioned in Mehma Prakash, this is mentioned in Suraj Prakash. The painter then paints this image of Guru Tegh Bahadur. In the stories, it does mention that, the painter couldn't properly do the face of the Guru, so the Guru then did it himself. But again, this shows that we do have contemporary paintings of the Guru. So Guru Tegh Bahadur is traveling through Dhaka at this point. He's visiting all these old places, and he's also in the company of Raja Ram Singh. And this again ties in with the media aspect that I was talking about. So when Guru Tegh Bahadur was in Patna, before he goes off on these travels, Raja Ram Singh, this guy here, this is a contemporary painting as well of Raja Ram Singh of Amber. So this is what, you know, you can imagine Guru Tegh Bahadur, you know, who he's with, which is really interesting when you look at what he's dressed as, his royal attire, what have you. So when Guru Tegh Bahadur was in Patna, Raja Ram Singh was actually passing through Patna on his way on a mission to Assam, which is basically, you know, Bangladesh. And we know this from the Hukamnamas of Guru Tegh Bahadur as well, where he explicitly writes, you know, back home to Patna, you know, I've gone east with the Raja. He actually tells some of his Sikhs, it looks like he left in a little bit of a hurry, because he tells some of his Sikhs in Patna, hey, I've already left. You guys should, you know, travel through the night and meet me. Otherwise, you'll basically miss me. So they're traveling out east. He's writing these letters back home. And he's on this mission with Raja Ram Singh. And people have been talking about how when Ram Singh is going to Assam, he's going there to wage war. And Guru Tegh Bahadur essentially acts as a diplomat to kind of bring peace to that area. Now, to be really honest, scholars are only now really unpacking some of the dynamics that were occurring in the Mughal Empire. So Raja Ram Singh is actually serving under Aurangzeb, like Aurangzeb had sent him out east. And, you know, to be clear, the relationships that certain rulers of areas had, like Raja Ram Singh with the Mughal Empire, is extremely complicated and foggy, and I don't think it's germane to this conversation. But it should be noted that, you know, just because somebody's serving under a political interest, it does not necessarily say too much about them. Like, so Raja Ram Singh's father fought with Dara Shikoh, I believe, you know, who was Aurangzeb's rival. So all of these things are very complicated to unpack. And for those who want to go into that, like Jeevan Singh, I know you're going to be studying this area. Dr. Faruqi at Berkeley has written a good book on this, on Mughal princes. There's a really good book I heard, Emperor Who Never Was, Dara Shikoh in Mughal India by Supriya Gandhi is also good, I've heard. Those type of books would be good to unpack that area. But Guru Tegh Bahadur is traveling with Ram Singh out east. He's performing a diplomatic role. He's bringing peace to these areas so that, you know, no more fighting is occurring that needs to be occurring. And actually then Ram Singh comes back with Guru Tegh Bahadur. So he's successful in his mission there. And as I mentioned, Ram Singh serving under Aurangzeb, and there is conflict between that relationship. As we know from Sikh texts and other sources, Aurangzeb at that point is causing a lot of strife with the native population. This is told in Sikh sources, you know, from Guru Gobind Singh onward, Gosoba, Gurblas, Pasha Chemi, Dasami, you know, what have you. It's throughout. We've all heard of the Kashmiri Pandit story. The Kashmiri Pandits come to Guru Tegh Bahadur. This is mentioned in Gurblas Pasha Dasmi in 1751. There's a whole chapter assigned to this. For those who say that, you know, the story evolved later on, it is written in our history in pre-colonial sources. In the Sikh sources, it mentions, so as we go into this side of the Shahidi of Guru Tegh Bahadur, it relates to all of these aspects of the political, of the martial, of the common narrative, the spiritual, the meditative, because this is kind of a culmination of all of those aspects in one act. So the Sikh sources, it mentions how Aurangzeb wanted the Guru to perform a miracle. Essentially, this was common practice in that day. Aurangzeb, whoever he wanted to snuff out, he was calling these people to Delhi. So the court, you know, if you could perform, if you think you're so holy, then perform a miracle. And if you can't, you know, then, well, off with your head. And we have sources, you know, letters, diaries, court records that talk about this practice where Aurangzeb is doing this. And Sikh sources mention this as well. And as a result, we all know the valiant and brave martyrdom, the Shahidi that Guru Tegh Bahadur performed there in Delhi, not giving in, not converting to Islam either. because that was, the option. It was like, if you think you're so holy in your context as a Hindu, as a Sikh, as a yogi, as a sadhu, as whatever, then do this miracle. Otherwise, you've accepted defeat, and you should convert to Islam, because obviously you have no powers. And this is immortalized in the writings of Guru Tegh Bahadur's son, Guru Gobind Singh, and his Vichitra Natak, talking essentially about the demise of the Mughal Empire. And I think this is interesting because people associate the demise of the Mughal Empire with, in a Sikh context, with Guru Gobind Singh's Zafarnama, the letter to Aurangzeb, and after that, kaput. But here, Guru Gobind Singh is associating that demise with his father's Shahidi. And this line requires a little bit of unpacking, and I'll explain why as we go through it. So Guru Gobind Singh writes that, Tikar for Dilis Sir, Prapur Kiya Piyan. So Tikar for is actually an idiom. It's a muhavara. It's a Hindi muhavara. So if you look into, Hindi idiom dictionaries, which you can find online, this tikara forna means to place blame on somebody's head. Literally, tikara or tikara is a pot, and to break the pot over somebody's head means to assign blame on them. This is something that I've seen translated incorrectly at times. So here, Guru Gobind Singh is saying that, Guru Tegh Bahadur put this blame on Aurangzeb's head, and actually doesn't even dignify Aurangzeb by mentioning his name, just says Dil East. Dilis means like Delhi, the East, like the Ishwar, the master, the king of Delhi. Doesn't even dignify him calling his names, and then says Prabhu Puruk Kiya Piyan. He then left for the abode of the divine. Tegh Bahadur Si Kriya Kari Na Kinhu An, that such deeds performed by Guru Tegh Bahadur, there's not going to be anybody in the world that's going to come to be able to match that. So here we're seeing that, by Guru Tegh Bahadur giving a Shahidi there, by not giving in, by being resilient, valiant, in front of that circumstance, that he's blamed Aurangzeb. Aurangzeb is now blamed for this martyrdom, right? And we see after that, Bahadur Shah, when Aurangzeb passes, the Mughal Empire is in disarray. They don't know how to maintain control over their various constituents. And there's a slow demise there in the 1700s. And so Guru Gobind Singh is accrediting this to the blame that has been associated with Aurangzeb's tyranny. Guru Gobind Singh continues on talking about this, about how his father, for the sake of righteousness, and this is interesting, because again here Guru Gobind Singh is using another idiom, sir. Here, sir literally in Arabic means secret, and this can be a little bit confusing here, but this is an idiom that is used throughout text. Even in Hir Ranja, this idiom is used. The line in Hir Ranja is sir jai na yaar da sir diche. A lover may lose their head, but they won't reveal the secret of their love, essentially. And this is in Varashas here, so mid-1700s. You can also find this in Punjabi idiom dictionaries as well. So Guru Gobind Singh is using that idiom here to say that, Guru Tegh Bahadur, he gave his head, but he didn't reveal his divine secret. In the sense that, and he's explaining here, Guru Gobind Singh, that, these people that go around, Natak Chetak means like, performing miracles, quackery, like pretending like you know how to do something when you obviously don't know how to do something. And he's talking about this, hypocrisy that these people are going around, holy people, Prablogan, the people of God, the divine people, religious people, spiritual people. At that time, we're going around being like, yeah, I can perform a miracle, I can do this, I can do that. And Guru Gobind Singh just cuts it down, saying that, divinely people, spiritual people, religious people, even just talking about those type of things, they get ashamed. They have lodge. It's not even part of their type of practice. And this again goes back to of course, Guru Tegh Bahadur wasn't going to perform a miracle there. People don't, all that type of nonsense, is hypocritical. It's Pakhand. The word Guru Gobind Singh uses in Braj is dimb. And Guru Gobind Singh writes extensively on that, and that's something that I think is the main takeaway that we can take away from Guru Tegh Bahadur's life, which feeds into Guru Gobind Singh's life, because this happens when Guru Gobind Singh is extremely young. He hears of this story, he knows of what happened, that Guru Tegh Bahadur wasn't there pretending like he could do a miracle or this or that, or trickery or quackery and what have you. And then Guru Gobind Singh in his writings, knowing that, when you look at the Guru Gobind Singh's writings, it provides a lot of context. In Vichitra Natak, there's extensive passages about Pakhand, dimb, as he calls it, hypocrisy, like yogis wear these earrings and they have jata jute, they have matted hair, they do all these type of things. And he's like, that's all nonsense. I don't do any of that. And then he writes extensively the Charitropakhyan, 405 small stories about deceit. People may think these stories are related to sexuality, but their main emphasis is on deceit, regardless. It could be men, women, yogis, kings, servants, warriors. The stories are quite vast and they talk about subjects of all sorts, but their main connection, the thread in all of them, is that people are deceiving people. Whether, there's a lot of stories about people, pretending that they can do miracles, pretending they can do this and that. And Guru Gobind Singh writes extensively about that, being like, that's basically all nonsense. And, the people of God, spiritual people, religious people who are dharmic, who are righteous, they wouldn't believe or do any of that, wouldn't talk about any of that. And I think that translates well to a modern application of Sikhi on our reflections of Guru Tegh Bahadur on this, 400th Parkash Purab, Purab of Guru Tegh Bahadur, that the Gurus fought against zulm, like oppression, but they also fought against Pakhand, dimb, hypocrisy, and this association that, to be religious, to be dharmic, to be righteous, to be spiritual, that you can do all this nonsense. And I think that's something that we can take as students, as young people, so that we don't get led down wrong paths as well, which is kind of, I think, the main purpose of the Charitropakhyan, the writings of Guru Gobind Singh. And I'm going to end here with this image here, reflecting the various sides, characteristics, virtues of Guru Tegh Bahadur. And you have the common narrative, very peaceful, meditative, but you also have the political, representing the meaty, as well as the martial. And we know that Guru Tegh Bahadur embodied all these traits, just like his father, Guru Hargobind, just like Guru Har Rai would be his nephew, and just like his grandson, Guru Har Krishan, essentially his grandson. That's why Guru Har Krishan says Baba Bakale, like my Baba, my grandfather is in Bakale. That's why whoever found him there, Lubana, he said, this Guru Tegh Bahadur makes sense because that's his Baba, that's his grandfather. And just like his son, Guru Gobind Singh, also represented that meaty and beaty. So these are the reflections I wanted to talk about, and I wanted to end here thanking Cambridge for inviting me. And I'm looking forward to the discussion. I hope people are open with their questions, and we can have a good chat after this.
Thank you so much, Jvala. That was a fascinating talk, and I'm sure everyone got a lot out of it, especially the multifarious guns and attributes of Guru Tegh Bahadur, which we sometimes take a little bit for granted. Just a reminder, as Jvala and as in the chat, if you have any questions, please do put them in the chat. If you'd like to raise a point, maybe just raise your hand on Zoom, or again, put in the chat that you'd like to speak and we can unmute you. Just want to avoid everyone talking over each other. Maybe we'll kick off the discussion with one of the kind of themes of questions that we got in kind of before the talk started on Guruji's life, and maybe one of the guns of Guru Tegh Bahadur as the renunciate or the detached. There are schools of thought that say that Guruji was first named Tyagmal and was given the name Tegh Bahadur at a later stage. And when they were married, one of my favorite snippets from your podcast, actually, Jvala, is that jalebis were served at the langar there, which is kind of probably where my head is. But maybe you can talk a little bit more about kind of the young Diagmal or Tegh Bahadur as the detached, the renunciate, and then how that kind of morphed into, the brave warrior of which we know today.
It's interesting because, this is talked about more modernly about, Guru Tegh Bahadur having that name Diagmal. To be honest, in Sikh sources like Bansali Nama, like the sources that I mentioned at the start of the presentation, not to go through all of them again, but these sources don't really mention that. I have seen Mughal sources contemporary of that time period mentioning that Tegh Bahadur's name is also Diagmal. They say it like that. So in terms of Sikh history and how the Guru's remembered, the memory of the Guru through those Sikh sources, I don't see really Diagmal in those texts, in regard to 400th Parkash and these type of texts, but that idea of the Guru being extremely embodying concepts about renunciation and detachment are certainly there. That's in the early texts that mentions, like I said, Guru Tegh Bahadur is almost in a way antisocial from far. He doesn't really, even in Kirtpur, where Guru Hargobind, that was his last city, is where he passed away. When they were staying there, Guru Tegh Bahadur would come visit his father maybe after 20, 25 days, it mentions. In between that time, he was just by himself, he was just doing meditation. At the end of Guru Hargobind's life, it mentions how Mata Nanaki, his mother, is worried like any mother would be. What's my son going to do after you pass away? He can't get a job. He obviously doesn't know how to work in the administration of things, because he spends his time in meditation, because he spends his time focusing upon the divine. And, that is a trait that you see throughout Sikh history. But, as the purpose of this presentation is that was there for sure. But in addition to that, we do hear that the Guru is riding along his father, when going to the forest to hunt. We hear that, the Guru does participate in helping to save the city of Kartarpur in that battle. So it's really interesting. That's why Guru Tegh Bahadur's life is so interesting, because it presents very extreme examples of these virtues being played out. We hear of the renunciate Guru Tegh Bahadur, but also we hear about the martial Guru Tegh Bahadur. And then we hear about the political Guru Tegh Bahadur, riding alongside Raja Ram Singh of Amber, and he's like one of the top Raja's ministers of Aurangzeb. It's just not like he's with the local mayor. We're talking top political. He's on that level where he's rubbing shoulders with the people at the top. So all of which to say that it presents a very diverse, very multifaceted understanding and picture of Guru Tegh Bahadur. But certainly those concepts were there in the old text. But as per the name Diagmal, like you guys posted, some of the old texts mention that Guru Hargobind himself named him Tegh Bahadur upon birth. So that's something that requires more research, to be honest.
Yeah, thank you. It's really interesting. Again, I think it comes clear that the Sant Sabai idea as well. I think you said they were 14 years old in the Battle of Kartarpur. So I mean, that's in itself is a big thing. The other thing that I was just thinking about throughout the presentation, thank you for that, was maybe touching a bit on the Sakhis of, I think it was Baba Gudiptaji's wedding, when they gave away their riches almost to the homeless or the beggar that they saw on the street. And also maybe if you've got a few minutes just on any other examples. So I think there was an example of them giving their horse away as well.
This is what I love about the pre-colonial text, is that when Santokh Singh is writing this, he's taking you back into time to that environment, to that culture, essentially. And that culture, I think, has been it's been diluted since. So this is a trait that you see, like you mentioned, Baba Gurdita. This is something that you see across different events. So even, for example, when different gurus are sent to the throne, before that happens, what they do is they go out, basically before any important event, they go out and they donate to charity, they feed the homeless, they help people, to get their blessings for the event that's going to happen. So, for example, I think is when Guru Har Rai ascends to the throne. People go out. Guru Har Rai himself goes out and donates, gives to charity of the homeless people. And basically that it's through the blessings of these poor people, of these homeless people, of these unfortunate people, that they will be able to be successful in their endeavors. And I think that's something that's people still do in India today. Like upon, this is something that I remember my mom telling me about my grandmother, my nani, who on birthdays she would go out of her kids' birthdays and donate to the unfortunate. Make a bunch of food and give it to them, being like, okay, it's because of your blessings that my kids will be well and my life will be good. So I think that's something that the old culture had. I think that people in England are still doing with the food banks and stuff like that, but particularly it's important on auspicious days, on important days, to go out and feed the poor. I think that's been a tradition in our culture for some time.
Yeah, absolutely. We just had a question come through in the chat, and I think it's quite pertinent to what you said about pre and post-colonial sources with regards to the names. But the question is, how accessible would you say these sources are, and the general understanding of pre-colonial texts in academia? And I suppose as a follow-on to that, we also had a question come through which says, how different and how much kind of contrast is there in the narrative between pre and post-colonial sources, and why is it so important for us as Sikhs to engage with pre-colonial ones?
So I'll answer this by Arjun Singh first. How accessible they are. They're accessible in the sense that we can find texts, we have accessibility to them. We don't have accessibility to them in English. So how accessible are they to the diaspora? They're not very accessible at all, which is why I think I've endeavored through the Swedish podcast to kind of give people that accessibility. There is accessibility if your Punjabi is really good to listen to Katha. People have recorded entire Katha recordings of 400th Parkash, of 400th Parkash. That's there online, but your Punjabi has to be pretty proficient to grasp all of that. What's the general understanding of pre-colonial texts in academia? I think that's largely what academia focuses on at the current moment. So I think there's there, and I think that's why academics spend years in terms of language training, in terms of contextualizing ways in which to understand different histories and memories and what these histories are doing. So for example, today when we look at pre-colonial texts, we'll see that, there might be some mythology infused in this. How are we to engage in that? Should we just discard it? Or are there methods in which we can kind of read between the lines between some of that? So, that's what academia trains people to do. So I think that's there. Post-colonial, really important question. Ties into what Arun Singh was saying before, that, we mentioned this practice. It's interesting. I've not heard about that practice. But as you go through these texts, you see that, that was a common practice. Everybody used to do that. And this is something that I think is really important, is that the pre-colonial, there's such a systemic shift when the British Raj are in India, with the advent of their schooling system, with the young Sikh youth going through these schools, with them looking up to Western styles of historiography, that when they start writing history, Veer Singh and the Singh Sabha lot in the early 1900s, to be clear, first of all, they're not even against the old text, the pre-colonial. They just want to make it more palatable. They want to be more clear with their history. Veer Singh himself had published Suraj. So, but there's something that changes and something that is missed out when that happens. And when we look through the pre-colonial, even though there may be differences between, what Suraj Prakash says on some issue and then another Granth says on another issue, but when you look at it as a whole, the pre-colonial presents a certain atmosphere, a certain environment, a certain vibe that is not there in the post-colonial. And I think that's what's so important. And that's why in the podcast, I'm trying to be as literal as I can and trying to make the translation make sense to the listener, is that the way that information is curated, the things that it brings up, the traditions it brings up, like the giving of charity on important days, I think that really paints a different picture than what Punjab was post-colonial and what Sikh history was in a post-colonial sense. It paints a more nuanced photo of what was going on, and it paints a photo that I think is more aligned with the writings of the gurus. So, for example, there was that line that we just looked at from Dasam that said, Prabhupur ki apiyan, Tegh Bahadur ke chalt payo, jagad ke sokh hai, sab jag payo, jai 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 surlok. That when Guru Tegh Bahadur passed away, the whole heavens, as he was traveling through the heavens, the whole heavens, were saying jai jai, victory, victory to Guru Tegh Bahadur. And this is something, if we listen to 400th Parkash, the writer Santokh Singh is filling in the dots there. He's writing that idiom or proverb or that idea. He's filling in that out in a story, in a narrative way. So when if anybody's listening to an episode where somebody passes away and you hear, okay, like they go through into the heavens to the realm of the divine, he's not just saying that because he's saying that, he's basing that off of what the gurus have written. And I think the pre-colonial texts are important because they are coming out of institutions and lineages that I talked about that are directly linked with the guru. So Santokh Singh comes out of that Gyani Abunga, that institution of Gyanis who are writing their works based on what Bhai Mani Singh has written. And in that sense, you got to give that more deference than you give somebody like if I just started writing history, or if you just started writing history. How disconnected are we from our own institutions, from that old culture, from that mindset, from our understanding about Gurbani? There's worlds of difference. So that's why the pre-colonial is so important, because there's a systemic shift that happens when the British are there that change things, and it's just different after that. So I think it's just more enjoyable as well. I think people who are reading these texts, they start to grasp things like that, like the charity on auspicious days, the jalebis that are served. Like that's another thing. In a way it's different, but in a way it's familiar. Like when people hear about that wedding story, it's like, oh yeah, that sounds like how a wedding is today. And that's interesting, because then when you're at a wedding today and somebody hands out a jalebi, you're like, oh, did you know that in Guru Tegh Bahadur's wedding they also handed jalebis? And it makes you think about that. You think about Guru Tegh Bahadur at that moment. What's more valuable than that?
Definitely. Thank you very much. And just another plug, I guess, just to the podcast itself. I think that you brought it a bit back there, saying how it's relatable. I think listening to the podcast myself, I think is very accessible to everyone. It's quite funny as well. So definitely do take a look at that as well. Just to sort of turn the conversation a bit towards Salok Mullah Noma Barney, could you just tell us a bit about how that was compiled, and then I think maybe a bit about the letters to and from Guruji?
Yeah, so this is interesting. Everybody hears these sloks when they go to a part. It's read at the end of Guru Granth Sahib. In Guru Blas Fatshai Shemi, it mentions, so this is narrated by Mani Singh Shaheed, written down by Bhagat Singh. It talks about how when Guru Tegh Bahadur was imprisoned by Aurangzeb, it was in that jail where he was writing those sloks. And I think it's up to Pauri 53. So he writes these Pauris, and Bhai Mani Singh says himself that these sloks that Guru Tegh Bahadur is writing, they're infused with such vairag, such detachment and gyan, wisdom, spiritual awareness. And he says that he's written these. There's a little bit of back and forth. So for people who don't know, when he gets to a certain point, he writes a letter to his young son, Gobind Rai at that time, in a form of a couplet. And Bin Sabli Nama mentions this as well, this little back and forth that Guru Tegh Bahadur wrote this letter. And Bin Sabli Nama is interesting. It actually mentions like he wrote it in Farsi script and then he sent it out, which is interesting. So then the young Gobind Rai gets this letter, Sangha Saka Sabta Jagai, I think is the line, one of the doharas there. And Guru Gobind Singh, that slok is testing Guru Gobind Singh. So then Guru Gobind Singh writes another slok back as a letter. And that proves his value as Guru. Guru Tegh Bahadur is happy. He writes another slok. What's interesting is he does not only writing a slok to his young son, he also writes a slok, one to his mother, Mata Nanaki, and one to his wife, Mata Gujri, to comfort them as well. And these are the ending sloks of Slok Mahala Nama. They are, in some of the old Sarups actually, what's interesting is that they said Mahalla Daswan for that one slok that Guru Gobind Singh wrote. In modern Sarups, that's not there. Understandable, small changes like that don't change the essence, but that was a way to indicate to people who were unaware of the Uttanika, of the historical context of those lines, that Guru Gobind Singh actually wrote one of the sloks. So for people who don't know, that is in Guru Granth Sahib that Guru Gobind Singh did write in there. So that's a little bit of the background there in regards to that.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's one of my favorite stories, I think, about how those two dohras at the end were a conversation between Gobind Rai and Guru Tegh Bahadur, and it's so much we can learn from that and apply to our lives. And perhaps it's like a nice segue into a question that we had from Anmol, and kind of maybe the last theme of questions that we'd like to ask you, Jvala, is how we can apply everything that you've said and all the questions that have been asked into our lives as Sikhs in the 21st century and in the diaspora today. So the question was, we are going to, sorry, I've just lost it. Thank you for this incredibly interesting talk. I've been able to gain so much knowledge. My question is, how can we implement these attributes into our lives?
That's a difficult question. I mean, I think for me, what really stuck with me was this fact that that father-son relationship, Guru Gobind Singh, so first of all, Guru Tegh Bahadur was out on travels when Guru Gobind Singh was born. So Mata Gujri is pregnant while that Raja Ram Singh is passing through Patna, and then Guru Tegh Bahadur travels along with him out to Assam, and they're traveling for many years, actually. It's not, he's there for a couple of weeks. He leaves the family in Patna for many years. The young Gobind Rai is born. He's without his father for something about 4 or 5 years. And, Guru Tegh Bahadur comes back. He spends maybe 5 or 6 years with the young Gobind Rai, right? And, that's the only interaction that Guru Gobind Singh has with his father. But, like, as I mentioned, through the Dasam Guru Granth Sahib, the writings of Guru Gobind Singh, you can kind of really feel the essence of Guru Tegh Bahadur there because of that notion against Pakhand, against dim, against hypocrisy, against pretending that you're something you are not, which I think is a major thrust in those writings of the Chitratropakyan, the stories about deceit, how not to be fooled, how not to be deluded by people who are, really deceitful. So how to implement these attributes in our life? Perhaps one way to say it is, one of the nishans of Guru Tegh Bahadur is, Gur Prasad, he writes in the Hukamnama and stuff, perhaps it's through the Guru's grace that, these attributes can be imbued. One way is by listening through the stories, and that's something that Santokh Singh writes, is that, through listening to the stories of Guru Tegh Bahadur, through listening to the stories of Guru Nanak to Guru Gobind Singh, we start to imbue ourselves with those attributes, with those characteristics, because we listen to them, suniye, we acknowledge them, maniye, and then slowly we can practice them. because perhaps first we're not aware of these attributes, so we first have to hear them, and then we have to recognize them that they're important, and then by practicing them, they become imbued within us. So I think one way to start is to listen to the stories, and that's how that's how Sampradaya tradition kind of begins the process here to, go down that road. Is the first step is itihas, first step is history, and that then nurtures prem in the guru, because otherwise, you'd be like, why do I care what the guru wrote? So I think the first step would be itihas,
I think you touched on something really interesting there as well, and really pertinent. So the idea of Biyad, I think, so in 400th Parkash Granth, there's obviously mention of some of the Shaheed Singhs singing as well. So could you maybe touch a bit on, I don't know, say Paimati Dasji, and maybe again, that could be one sort of element of how we can imbue it in our lives today. So the idea, I guess, that every breath we take is in remembrance of Waheguru. But yeah, I think you can expand on that a bit better.
I mean, when talking about Matidas and Satidas, I mean, these are titans. These are giants. These are people that we say it in our das, like when we remember them, we just say Bolo Vaheguru. Like we say Vaheguru in shock that these Singhniya had that amount of civic, that amount of resolve and faith. I think it's only by listening to the Tahas, listening to the stories. There's a story actually, it's interesting, in 400th Parkash between Baba Bidhi and Bhai Gurdas, because it's Bhai Gurdas. There's a story with Guru Hargobind where I think something along the lines of Bhai Gurdas says, if the Guru requires me to give Shahidi, I'm gonna do it 100%. I'm there. And Bidhi Chand is like, listen, you say all that stuff, you can say whatever you want, but without the Kirpa of the Guru, it's not going to happen. And it's kind of a longer story. I'm not going to go into all of it here, but Bhai Gurdas has kind of made a fool a little bit there to show that, that type of civic, that type of resolve, that type of determination, that type of sacrifice, it's not really up to us at that point. It's really something else working through us. But in regard to Satidas and Matidas, I mean, these guys are in the presentation, there's an image of them, right? When Guru Tegh Bahadur is performing that Shahidi there, below them was probably Satidas or Matidas, one of them. It's not listed, but these are the close associates of Guru Tegh Bahadur. And I guess one way to pay homage to them is through that family, Satidas and Matidas, the Shibbar family, comes the text Bansabli Nama. Kesar Singh Shibbar comes out of that family. He is in close association with the Gurus. He, as a kid, is growing up with Mata Sundari and Mata Sahib Deva. He's in their divan. He's in their court. So he has held a lot of those stories from Satidas and Matidas. He's written those down. So for those who want to read them, they're in the chapter related to Guru Tegh Bahadur and Bansabli Nama, 17 and 69. Yeah, perhaps we should translate that section. But yeah, it's hard to talk about how can we be like them. I think it's just like it's beyond our comprehension a little bit.
Whilst we're on the topic of Guru Tegh Bahadur Ji Shahidi and the painting that you mentioned, I think what's striking about it is, and this gets taught certainly in some schools of thought, is that Guru Tegh Bahadur Ji's head fell off this sarir before the executioner could even hit them, and part of, I think, the miracle, the sirar that you mentioned, was that was the miracle that Guruji gave their Shahidi as opposed to Shahidi being taken from them. I was wondering if pre-colonial sources, perhaps 400th Parkash or any of the other grants that you mentioned, talk about this and how we can look upon Shahidi as the Guruji giving something up as opposed to life being taken from them.
Yeah, for sure. And I think yeah, that's why I think maybe performing Shahidi is a good way to talk about it. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, the agency is all on him. Like that's how Guru Gobind Singh is framing it. This is not our own, thoughts about this. Guru Gobind Singh is saying that that was a deliberate action. That was a deliberate performance to place on top of Aurangzeb. Like, oh, that's it now. That's a wrap for the Mughal Empire because of the type of oppression that you are performing. So I think in the pre-colonial texts, they work off of those ideas mentioned in Gurbani, that the gurus have agency over these events. And I think when we listen to the stories about Guru Arjan Dev Ji Shahidi as well, especially from 400th Parkash, that's something that comes out that, even at that time, Sikhs were like, oh, how could this happen to the Guru? But the wise, like Bhai Gurdas and Baba Buddha Ji in that court, in that setting, they reassure everybody, including Mata Ganga Ji, Guru Arjan Dev Ji's wife, that listen, Guru Arjan Dev Ji has orchestrated all of this anyways. Like Guru Tegh Bahadur has orchestrated all of this anyways. That they are the ones acting this whole play out, and it's for us not to judge of why something's happening, but for us to kind of imbue the characteristics that they exemplified. So in regard to pre-colonial texts, yeah, they do mention those type of stories. They do talk about these events from the angle that the guru holds the agency in those settings, which is true. I mean, he could have converted, he could have subdued himself there. I mean, he didn't have to resist, right? It was that resistance that was the performance of the Shahidi, not to give in, not to pretend to do hypocrisy, any of that quackery, not to do that, to say that I will give my life to protect those people. I think that's the main thrust of what the pre-colonial talks about. And any difference, this is a question that we talked about before. I think you guys had sent me a message about the differences in pre-colonial texts and how do you reconcile differences in pre-colonial texts. And I think it's important for us here as well to talk about that as well. And I would say that any difference in pre-colonial texts that appear, and there are differences, people write things that, people have different opinions. Perhaps somebody heard something different. Perhaps somebody's trying to narrate the story in a different way. 100% there's going to be differences in these type of writings. But I think what's more important, what's more different is the pre versus post-colonial. I think there's such a substantial shift in thought process between the post and the pre that any such minor difference in the pre-colonial, I mean, it's so minor in comparison when you think about how they're relating these events. And that's why I'm saying, okay, we should look to the pre-colonial and we should take these sources seriously, and I've listed the sources at the start that come out of major Sikh institutions, major Sikh lineages. There are other sources. You're going to find like a random court record here from somebody, or a random guy here write something. And of course that comes into our consideration when we talk about, deliberating over history. But I think it's really important that we give deference, we give more respect and consideration to texts that are from the foundation of our institutions, like Bhai Mani Singh. Who's going to walk up to Bhai Mani Singh and be like, I disagree with you, like that would take some balls to do that. So the differences in these pre-colonial texts, I think, are negligible in the sense that, sure, when we're talking about these things, we're going to have to differentiate between what, some of the differences, but I think that can all happen in a conversation that's quite different than what people are writing today versus what people have written in the past. All of which just to emphasize that I think these conversations will be deeper, richer, more informative if we base them upon the old texts and the traditions and lineages.
Yeah, definitely. And just touching on the previous question that we had about how can we implement these attributes to our lives. So I think if we look, so obviously some of the texts are quite difficult to access for the armed sort of person. But even if we just look at the life of, I think, Guru Tegh Bahadur ji and the other gurus as well. So if we took one of the, you already mentioned about detachment. So if we take that view of detachment to the Panch Jod, also maybe even an impartiality to Dukh and Sukh. So everything's happening for a reason in day-to-day life. So I don't know, I've got something big that I need to revise for or something, and my work's deleted. You just take it, you know, on the shoulder and carry on. And I think the other thing was also, maybe if we talk a bit about the Shahidi as well. So the idea that the Gurus and Sikhs in general stand for freedom of speech and faith, which I think throughout all of the Gurus' lives it's been very clear. So I think if we apply that to maybe something that we're all experiencing now, so with the COVID situation in India and around the world, and the lack of sort of control on that, and then also maybe some of the Morja, so the Kisan Morja, BLM at the moment. So these are all things that we can all sort of take a step towards, I guess, be it through Daswand or posting, you know, just getting the word out. So I think those are very sort of practicable things that we can do on a day-to-day basis. And I guess just making the effort to learn a bit more every day. I know it's hard to say, okay, yeah, we're going to do this every day, but I think a few minutes here and there, or even just listen to the podcast, I found it really, really interesting. And the facts that you drop are really cool as well. But yeah. So I guess any other things related maybe to the life of Guru Tegh Bahadur ji, and any sort of, maybe if we say 3 key teachings from their lifetime, their Jyoti Jod or Shahidi, and then some of their Bani as well.
Yeah, for sure. Sorry?
Any sort of key themes or things that we can take away from that?
For sure. I mean, you said it yourself in regard to the Bani, the sloks. There's that theme that rides through, and this is what's so interesting is that Bani Singh himself is commenting on this, that, you know, this is how he sees it, and this is how even just when we read it, we all feel that as well. I had a friend recently just tell me that, you know, he read Slok Malanama and was like, man, I should really make some changes in my life. And that's, you know, those writings of Guru Tegh Bahadur are very powerful, because they bring forward, like, you know, different examples and really illustrate that, you know, what you think this life is, it's like, you know, there's a lot more going on. Why are you so attached to this? There's that aspect of renunciation, detachment, that I think is a key. It's part of the narrative that we have with Guru Tegh Bahadur. It's important that we talk about it as well. But I think that's a key theme throughout Guru Tegh Bahadur's life. It's like, yeah, if my head goes, fine. Like, what does it matter? I'm doing what I have to do. And that's leads us to the second thing, which is, you know, Sikhi. This is how some Pradhagyanis have talked about it, is we are not opposed to any dharam, any mindset, any ideology. We're only opposed to zulm, oppression, and pakhand, dim, hypocrisy, quackery, all that nonsense. And I think that really comes off in Guru Tegh Bahadur's life. When we look at the political, we see him, you know, traveling with Raja, being a diplomatic emissary, trying to bring peace, trying to bring people together who represent different aspects, you know, who are you know, fighting, who are at odds. You know, being that bridge, you know, bringing that glue between people, I think is what Guru Tegh Bahadur, that's how he lived his life, I feel, when he was Guru. And so those are some thematic points that kind of run through Guru Tegh Bahadur's life, as well as, you know, that martial side, I think we ignore a little bit. Perhaps it's uncomfortable to talk about in modern times. I think it's something that has been ignored in the post-colonial. We're kind of not sure how to conceptualize some of these practices, especially hunting. To be honest, I don't think that's completely a post-colonial thing. I think that's a pre-colonial thing as well, as we see mythological stories associated with hunting. I think that tells us from an academic perspective in regard to mythology interpretation. People talk about how certain times of mythology can imbue itself into a story when there are various audiences within that who are listening to that story as a way to kind of blend two different ideas together. So, for example, we know there's going to be a lot of vegetarians who are going to be listening to that story, and we know there's going to be a lot of other people who we eat meat, and some of the mythology there has been used to kind of bring those two audiences together. So in that Mulukda story, Guru Tegh Bahadur, or even in the stories I talk about in the podcast, Guru Hargobind, there's a Sikh from Kanchi who comes, Banaras, who sees Guru Hargobind eating or feeding his hawk meat, and he just really distraught. He's like, how could a spiritual person be chopping up pieces of meat and feeding it to another? And then Guru Hargobind tells him a story that, listen, you don't even know what's happening in this world. You don't know the past story. You don't know that this hawk was in one lifetime he was this, and the meat that I'm feeding it was something else. So there's that mythological narrative there to kind of bring together those two viewpoints. So all of which to say that I guess thematically going back to Guru Tegh Bahadur is that we sometimes miss some of these aspects when talking about him, and just to think again that as we study the Itihas, the history of the gurus, these gurus are multifaceted. They present all sorts of different virtues, characteristics, which their Sikhs then try to embody. And I think by kind of reflecting on the entirety of the Guru's life and practices, I think we are better off, and we are more likely to then embody them. So I do see a question here by Amrit saying, could you expand more on the Guru Shahidi being a watershed moment in the decline of the Mughal Empire? Like I said, that's how Guru Gobind Singh is framing it, that Guru Tegh Bahadur put this blame on Aurangzeb's head, that you've just gone too far now, this is it. And how does that differ from existing scholarship? I think existing scholarship is working to this idea, and you see this in some of the works, some of the Mughal works that I've read, talking about how post Aurangzeb there was a real difficulty in coalescing power. So for example, how things used to work at that time, on the passing of the emperor, the princes would kind of battle it out. And they would need the support from the various regions. They would need the support from various sadhus, holy people, pirs, fakirs, gurus, because those people represented constituents as well, in almost a similar way as today, in the sense that, what Sikh would support Aurangzeb after such an act, what Sikh would be up for that type of administration. So, post Aurangzeb, we see this decline. We see that people are beginning to separate themselves from the Mughal Empire. And a lot of the work that I'm doing in the Suraj podcast is kind of, in a way, talking about this, because we're seeing the relationship between the different gurus, like Guru Hargobind with Jahangir, and then how that relationship changes with Shah Jahan. And we have to be cognizant that the Sikh relationship with the Mughal Empire is rocky. It's, at times, even Bhai Gurdas writes this, that there was times when the Badshahs, when the emperors would come to the Guru's house, like in Guru Nanak's time, Guru Angad, Guru Ramadas, Guru Ramdas. And now our Guru is being sent to jail because of the Badshah. So Bhai Gurdas mentions that explicitly. So there's this rocky relationship. I think Mughal scholarship right now is on a peak of development. There's a lot of good scholarship coming up, and I think Sikh sources are going to be a way to fill that in, because people have talked about in scholarship how, maybe this whole anti-Aurangzeb thing is a British idea, that the British came to India and they were saying, hey, Aurangzeb was so atrocious, he oppressed the people, we're here to save the people, we're the good people, but the Mughals are the bad people, so they're helping the local indigenous thing. And rightfully so, scholarship has been like, yeah, that's weird. We don't know how to deal with that. I think Sikh sources provide an angle, a lens, and a way to kind of show what certain people were thinking about Aurangzeb at that time. And like I mentioned, those early texts of Guru Vilas, I think those type of texts are going to shape some of this narrative going forward in terms of Mughal scholarship, in terms of Indian history as a whole. I think that's why Sikh history, Sikh academia has an important role to play in shaping these conversations that are going to be the foundation of how we look at that period of history. So that was a good question.
Just a few sort of quicker questions before I pass over to Jeevan to wrap up. So just in terms of some simple or easily accessible translations of Sikh history, particularly from the Guru's period of time, it's just one of the questions that we had in. Would you recommend any English translations that maybe you've come across? And also any good dictionaries for people who can understand and read Gurmukhi, but dictionaries for maybe some Brij Bhasha, that's also, you mentioned a bit.
So I'll do the dictionary one first, but yeah, Mahan Kosh is like the best thing to get. You can get that on PDF. Mahan Kosh was assembled by Kanzing Namba, early 1900s. It's a dictionary from, he takes all the important words from Sikh sources and he kind of provides a dictionary there. That's super important. In regard to Braj, it would be super useful for people to kind of just learn the script of Devanagari, because that gives them access then to Braj dictionaries. And in scholarship and academia, people have produced really good dictionaries. There's one that I use, it's called the McGregor Dictionary. If you just search McGregor Oxford Hindi English Dictionary, it says Hindi there, but it actually uses, it actually incorporates a lot of these old Braj words as well. And it gives the root of the word as well, if it's Arabic, if it's Farsi, if it's, if it comes from Sanskrit. So I think that's a really good tool. But that requires you to learn the script, Devanagari. But to be honest, the script is quite similar to Punjabi, so Gurmukhi. So I think for those serious learners, I think that would be that's a huge value add, I found, because then you can kind of use that along with Mahan Kosh to really pin down certain words and certain ways in which words are being used. Like that T Karana Forna, if I didn't have the ability to look through a Hindi Mahavara dictionary, like a Hindi idiom dictionary, I think that would have been lost on me. So I think that's important. Translations, there's a group in England, the Bhai Gurdas Institute, I think they're called. They produce Nanak Prakash translations. They have a volume 1 out. That's super useful. I think if anybody wants to learn the history of Guru Nanak, I think that would be the starting point. There's also a website, Sikh Scriptures in English. I'll just post that in the chat here. That's another translation, chapter by chapter, of Nanak Prakash. So Nanak Prakash is the beginning. I posted this in the chat. Nanak Prakash is the beginning of Suraj Prakash. It's just the stories related to Guru Nanak. Those stories written, I think just like 1815, 1820, by Santokh Singh, where he's looking at all the old Janam Sakhi literature and he's kind of curating that information. So super important and super valuable. The Nanak Prakash translation by the Bhai Gurdas Trust or Institute, and this link here, Sikh Scriptures to English. That was actually translated by somebody in England, Kamal Preet Singh Pradesi. So I would definitely look to that. In regard to other sources in English, to be honest, like Gur Soba has been translated, and that kind of gives a snippet. It gives a portion of Guru Gobind Singh's life. So I would look at that as useful. But there's not a lot that's been translated, and there are reasons for that. Hopefully academia, hopefully people in the field fill that void. That's a field that I'm trying to fill the void in by producing the podcast, by giving people access to the old sources, but like Suraj Prakash has not been translated, and it's enormous. Like I was saying, we did 135 episodes. We still have 135 more episodes to do to cover all the life of Guru Hargobind. And, it's just a ginormous text. It requires years of study even to just get into it. So there's a big gap, which is unfortunate. And I think by sponsoring people, by putting pressure on institutions to read some of these old texts, and that's, I think, a takeaway that all of us should have from this, is that when we have these conversations, we should base it on something. Like, you should always kind of ask people, this is how we're trained in a Western sense. And I think we're already trained in it. We might as well utilize it in this context as well. That, if somebody's saying something about a guru, or somebody's saying something about itihas, then, okay, awesome. Where's that from? Like, where are you getting that information? If it's your own interpretation, tell us that. And tell us how you got to that interpretation, which is fine. People can have interpretations. I do interpretations on these texts as well, but it should be based on something. So I think that's a takeaway that we should all have, that because then it prevents people from taking advantage of the youth, of people who are older, telling them things about history, about philosophy that are not true. And I think one way to do that is to anchor us to the old text. So it's not a great advice, but yeah, there's not a lot out there. Nanak Prakash stuff, I would start with that. It's really good. And then, for the missile period, Pant Prakash by Ratan Singh Pangu, if you Google that, you'll find a PDF of that in English. And the translation is reasonable. I would take a look at that. So the history after the Gurus, look at Pant Prakash in English. For the history of Guru Nanak, look to this link here, and the Nanak Prakash translation, volume 1 on the Bhai Gurdas Trust. And then you can look at Guru Soba, which has been translated. Google that, you'll find a PDF. Guru Soba PDF, English, you'll find it. That'll give you history of Guru Gobind Singh, a portion of it. So that's what I would recommend. Are there any online courses for Devanagari? Courses, I don't know, but you'll find it on YouTube. Actually, you'll find how people work through the script on YouTube. And honestly, once you just get a mapping, they map their letters, like how we write Ura Era Iri Sasahaha. They write theirs in a similar fashion. So you can map it 1-to-1, and just with a little bit of memorization, you'll be able to read Devanagari shortly. It's not like Shamukhi, it's not like Farsi. It's quite easy if you just map it 1-to-1 and then just start writing out words, start using a dictionary. You'll get it. It's quite easy. I think the value from that is huge, using those dictionaries. And I'll put the dictionary in the link here as well.
I was just going to add, while you're finding the link for the dictionary. So obviously nowadays with the internet, we've all got YouTube and a Google search. But I think you already touched on some of the work that Kampadis is doing. So I think the podcast, it's on Podbean. It's called it's just got, basically it's called Sikhism in Snippets, I think. And so that they've basically collated different gathas, which obviously done in by Gatha Vachaks, and it's all in one place. So I think that's also another thing that I found quite interesting, because it's not necessarily I'm going there to look for a certain topic, but something will pop up and you'll be like, oh, I want to listen to that, and then that was quite good one as well.
For sure, yeah, I would say, yeah, the work he's done is incredible, because he's collected all, he's managed that gurmatvichar.com site. That's a good site for you guys who are good with your Punjabi. Go to gurmatvichar.com. So much gatha on there, it's endless, many lifetimes worth. And they got good documents, good books on there, so that's just a good resource overall to look at. But yeah, that Podbean where he takes snippets from gatha, that's really useful as well.
That's great. We have very unfortunately reached or kind of surpassed our allotted time. There's been a flurry of messages thanking you, Jvala, for this talk and all the work you've done, and I'm sure everyone will kind of join me in thanking you. Before we wrap up, there's just a few points. Firstly, the committee has very kindly put this event together kind of in support of the Cambridge Gurdwara fundraiser. I'm sure one of them can put a link into the chat. If not, there's a link on the Cambridge University Sikh Society Facebook page. But the Cambridge Gurdwara, for anyone who's resident here or a student will know, has become a hub for Sikh students that we didn't have before. So it's a really important place for us and is in need of some dire repair work. So, and we'll put a link to the GoFundMe either into the chat or you can find it on the Facebook page. Before we go as well, I'd like to just reiterate and recommend to everyone, check out the Suraj podcast, the Mangalacharan website, Jvala on Twitter and Instagram. Is there anything else that I've missed that I need to plug for you before we wrap up?
No, I think that's all. I think starting, we're going to start putting video snippets on the YouTube channel for Suraj podcast. Like that jalebi you mentioned, that's going to be a video. So I think you did a little foreshadowing there. But yeah, so I think maybe check out the YouTube page for Suraj podcast. There's going to be weekly snippets from the Suraj podcast, the audio, but in video form. So check that out. But yeah, I think that's everything. And your book as well, 54 Punjabi Proverbs, which someone's just kindly reminded me of as well. So there's a wealth of resource there that Jvala has contributed, and I'm sure there'll be many more podcasts to come as well we can enjoy. So I think we'll end things there. Thank you again so much for your time. Thank you to everyone for attending. And before we say Fateh, just wish you all a very happy Gurpurab for the rest of your day. ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕਾ ਖਾਲਸਾ ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕੀ ਫਤਿਹ।